Hello and welcome to the Softercast, a podcast for everyone out there who wants thoughtful podcast support without any tech bro BS. I'm Amelia Freebie. I am the founder of Softer Sounds Podcast Studio and the host of this here podcast. On this show, I answer your questions about podcasting. Really, you can submit questions at the link in the show notes or below if you're watching on YouTube, and I will answer them. So let's dive into today's question. I have been doing a lot of sales calls recently, and today's question comes from kind of a compilation of the question I've heard on all of these calls. And that question is, how do I know when it's time to hire a podcast editor? I'll say that again. How do I know when it's time to hire a podcast editor? Well, what a great question. Definitely a great question to be asking if you're on, a discovery call with a podcast production studio. But I think this is a question that a lot of folks ask themselves. And some of you get close enough to do research and reach out to studios. And some of you just kind of hold it in the back of your mind and really maybe never look into it because you don't quite believe it's possible for you to have an editor to support your show. So I want to dive into this from a couple different angles today. And I want to start with a disclaimer, as I often do. And I just want to say that even though I am in the business of editing podcasts, that's how I support myself, that's how I support my team, we edit shows. Even though I'm in that business, it does not mean I think every show needs an editor. So this episode is not going to sit here and tell you you have to have an editor, or berate you for being thinking you can go it alone. No. Editing is a really big investment. And I know that if you're listening to this, you are a savvy podcaster who can figure out basic editing on your own. I love tools like Descript or Anchor or Ali2 or Iphonic for easy editing. Easy editing you can figure out by watching a couple YouTube videos and just running with it. And I encourage you to do that for as long as it makes sense for you. And maybe that's forever with your show. Maybe you edit your own show forever. Or you have a VA who edits your show and you don't need to hire a podcast editor. Again, I don't think that every show needs an editor, and I'm not here to tell you you have to find one immediately. That said, if you're listening to this episode, I imagine you are interested in getting some support for making your podcast. And I love that for you. I am always telling my clients that podcasting is not a solo sport, and a team makes all the difference for your show. So, why does a team make a difference? And how do you know when it's time to take the leap and hire one? Let's dive into this question. So I want to start by saying just the two things that all good podcast editors will do for you is improve your audio quality and give you your time back. If you are working with an editor, your show should sound great and you shouldn't have to spend time putting it together, right? That's the dream, right? That is, you want to record and you want to hand off the audio and then you want to get back a beautiful episode. All good podcast editors should do that for you. They should make your audio sound even better without you having to spend any time doing that. And for some folks, that's enough reason to hire an editor in and of itself, right? You're like, I want my audio to sound better. I want more time back. I don't want to spend my time doing this. I want more time back in my day. So I'm going to hire someone. Beautiful, amazing, love it. But I find that while those are the amazing effects of hiring an editor, in my experience, they're not really the reason people hire one, or they're not the motivating factor to actually part with your money and hire the editor. So why do people hire a podcast editor? This question is, how do I know it's time? Well, here's what I can tell you after dozens and dozens of calls with folks who are looking for editors. Generally, when people land on a call with me, it's for one of two reasons. Reason number one is they want to launch a podcast or create a new season of their existing show, but they know that they do not have time to handle all the steps that come between recording and publishing. These are often small business owners with busy family lives, and they have already learned the lesson that they can't do it all, so they know they need support. There's no question. It's this podcast is not going to happen if Someone else isn't doing most of the podcasting tech parts of it. And so they know up front, again, like I said, they've already learned that lesson of like, I can try to do it all, but it will just be miserable for everyone involved. So I'm going to hire someone to edit my show, someone to write my show notes, someone to publish it, someone to promote it. All these things editors can't do for you. That's kind of one camp of folks who show up on a call looking for an audio editor. Then camp number 2, there are my like DIY diehards. And these are the folks who've been creating their show. Maybe they've done 1 season or 2 seasons or 10 seasons by themselves, and they are burned out, like to a crisp. They are crispy. They are exhausted. How do they know they're burned out? Well, maybe they've got a huge backlog of recordings to put out and feel overwhelmed at the idea of literally even opening the folders or files. Maybe it's just literally living on an SD card or like inside their Zencaster. And they're like, I can't even look at it. It's way too overwhelming to even acknowledge how many like unedited episodes I have. Like the idea of putting them out in the world is too much. Or maybe they've started missing publication dates and they're like, at first I put my show out every Tuesday. Then it was like most Tuesdays, but sometimes the episodes would go up on Fridays. And then it was like every other week. And now it's like once a month, sort of, kind of. I don't even know when it releases anymore. And you might feel like scattered and stressed and maybe a little like embarrassed that you're like not keeping up with it. That's another great sign that you're burned out. Or another common one is that maybe your show's been on hiatus for a long time and you just can't muster the energy to bring it back. These are many signs for those like DIY diehards again, that you're burned out, that they're burned out. And those babes end up on calls with me because they know that they need support, but they're really resistant, to paying for something they know they can do themselves because they have this narrative that's like, I know I can do it, so I should just do it. I need to make myself do it. And I often work with them on just realizing that like that type of self-talk isn't what gets us to do things. And if we've lost that internal motivation to do it, maybe the next right step is to get support. And maybe it's not support forever. Maybe it's just support to get you through that burned out period until your motivation comes back. Or maybe you just stay on break until it reappears. There's nothing wrong with being on an extended podcast break. But anyway, that's it for an episode on podcast burnout. We'll get back into this episode about when do you know how to hire an editor. So to recap that piece, people normally end up on calls with me. There's kind of 2 camps. The people who know they need support because they've learned this lesson, like they can't do it all. They got to get help before they even try to begin again. And then the folks who are like really burned out and maybe telling themselves these stories of like, I know I can do it, so I really just should do it myself. And I've got to make myself do it. But that's just not working for them anymore. And let me tell you all, I have been both of these people. Really, honestly, normally myself, I fall into that second camp of burned out. And when I was talking about that kind of like archetype of the person who's got a huge backlog of recordings that they can't even look at, that was me 100% with my podcast, 50 Feminist States. I edited, I think 3 or 4 seasons all by myself. And then for that, I can't remember if it was the 4th season or the 5th season, I did this huge road trip. I had a dozen interviews and I could not make myself edit them. And so I had to hire someone. I needed help. I couldn't make myself do it. No matter how hard I tried to like force myself or entice myself to sit down to edit, I couldn't do it. For those of you watching on YouTube, you now get to watch my cat try to attack my headphone cord. For those of you listening, sorry, that's only on YouTube. But anyway, you hear an interruption, it's probably her. So I empathize with anyone experiencing podcast burnout. And I really try to hold a lot of tender space for the folks who come to Softer Sounds because they're in that place and they need support. We all need that sometimes. And here's the thing. Too often, in my opinion, people don't look for an editor until their show is on the brink of going away forever. And too many shows do go away forever because the creators can't get the support that they need. And here's the other thing. I know that if money was infinite, if you had infinite amounts of money, you would have an editor. You'd probably have one already. I don't know anyone who wants to do every single step of the podcast creation project on their own, but I know tons of people who just can't afford the podcast support that they're craving. You know, I live in the same world you do. I know that podcast editors can be really expensive. And I know that many of us as small business owners, you know, at the end of the day, getting an editor comes down to that like age old opposition that we get stuck in capitalism, which is that time versus money thing. I hate it. Right? It's so familiar and it's so false, but it feels so real. And we face it all the time. And I can't tell you if you have more time or more money right now. And I can't tell you if you have, quote unquote, enough time to edit your show on your own or enough money to hire an editor. You know, I'm not in your finances. I'm not in your day-to-day. I'm not in your body. Only you know that for yourself. What I can tell you is that you deserve support creating your podcast. Everyone deserves support creating their podcast. And there are lots of ways to get support. Maybe you support yourself using our 3-step podcast audit that's on the Softer Sound site. It's totally free. So maybe you support yourself with that free resource. Maybe you and a pod friend support each other by listening to each other's shows and spending an hour offering feedback and suggestions. Or maybe you pick something that you both want to do and you have an accountability group around it. Another way to get free support from somebody else who's a podcaster who just loves podcasts and wants to give you some genuine feedback. Maybe you do spend a little money and you book yourself a podcast reset retreat with me and you make this one-time investment in like deep diving into your show, reconnecting with your vision, streamlining your work show. You get that sort of expert advice and you take half a day off and you make this have this luxurious experience reconnecting with your show so it feels easier to create again. And maybe you do hire an editor who can handle editing your audio, writing your show notes, creating your marketing materials, and more so that you just totally take those pieces off of your to-do list. There are lots of ways to get support for creating your podcast that range from free to thousands of dollars and more. But you deserve support. No matter how much money you do or don't have, no matter how much time you do or don't have for your show. So all of this gets me back to my original question. Like, where did we start, Amelia? Where are we going? So we started with this question. How do I know it's time to hire a podcast editor? Or when is it time to hire a podcast editor? Well, it's definitely time to hire a podcast editor if you're at that breaking point, that pain point of, if I don't get some support, I don't think I can keep making my show. I definitely want you to get support if you don't have the capacity to keep creating your show. I also want you to get support before you reach that breaking point. I want you to get support before you're totally burned out. Whether that support is a friend, a Fiverr hire, or a production company like Softer Sounds, I hope you get the support you need to keep sharing your voice and creating your show. And that's the episode. I think this is the first time I'm not totally sure if I answered the question. So I'm going to give this one more try, one more go. How do I know it's time to hire a podcast editor? All right, here are like five signs. Let's go with this. Here are 5 signs it's time to hire a podcast editor. Number 1, it is time to hire a podcast editor if you love recording your show, but you dread everything else. If you are pumped to sit down on the mic and record by yourself or do an interview, but like the idea of ever looking at that audio again or putting it online makes you want to just like roll over and die, it's time to hire a podcast editor, babe. Number 2, it's time to hire a podcast editor if you are proud of your podcast, but you really wish it sounded more polished and some of your insecurities about the sound are holding you back from growing your show. So if you just can't get over how many ums or likes or background noise or the sound is hollow, and you just know that that is keeping your show from the next level of growth, of sponsors, of a bigger listener base, whatever it may be, it's time to hire a podcast editor. Number 3, it's time to hire a podcast editor if your podcast has been on hiatus for longer than you would like to admit, and you need support to bring it back. Again, I used this example before. Maybe you just hire an editor for your next 4, 6, 8 episodes, and then you're back into it and you take it back over yourself. But it's definitely time to hire a podcast editor if you just can't get it off hiatus by yourself. Number 4, it's time to hire a podcast editor if you feel like you're good at being a podcast host. Like, you know it. You are. I believe it. But you'd really love a thoughtful ear tuning into your content and just clearing out the random tangents or the questions that didn't land or the story that got told 3 times. You only need it once. If you want that type of support to take your show, again, just so it becomes even more potent, more poignant, more juicy, more, it lands better. If you want that kind of support, it's time to hire a podcast editor. And finally, number 5, it is time to hire a podcast editor if you wish you had a podcast editor. I want to affirm your desire for one. You want support. You want an editor. That is enough reason to hire one, even if you got to figure out how to make that work financially. Okay. Now I think I nailed it. I think we got all sorts of answers to this question. How do I know it's time to hire a podcast editor? And as we wrap up, I feel like I would not be a good business owner if I did not throw in a plug here at the end for Softer Sounds editing services. So there are a lot of podcast editors out there, from inexpensive audio files on Fiverr to very expensive audio engineers who do fancy sound engineering for your show. At Softer Sounds, we specialize in high quality, affordable audio editing with a softer touch. I like to say that we bridge the technical and the tender. Our editing packages include high quality audio editing that's done by a thoughtful human to make your episodes sound clear and impactful. They include free transcripts. They include personalized production dashboards. And they also include Voxer support so that you can share your stream of consciousness thoughts with me as you're trying to make your show and you need some help. And they include access to our super special online community called the Podcast Magic Membership that is only for our clients. So that's like a lot for episodes at current when I'm recording this in late 2022. I mentioned that we have I try to really make our audio editing affordable. And at this point in time, that means a range of, I think, $175 to $375 per episode. I should look that up before I said those numbers on here. I want to be transparent. I know that's not in a lot of people's budgets, but I've looked at a lot of editing websites and I can tell you we fall in the middle between the Fiverr hire and the sound engineers. And really, I think what we do at Softer Sounds that no one else does, that I have not found another production company that does, is that we specialize in the topics that are personally important to the folks that we serve. Softer Sounds is a safe and brave space for your episodes about reproductive justice and abortion, about motherhood and matrescence, about domestic labor and family systems, about magic and spirituality, about trauma and healing, about anti-capitalism and anti-racism. We really work on those those topics that are so important to the folks we serve, to the women and non-binary small business owners, humans, people who live with a variety of marginalized identities amidst these systems of oppression that we're all embroiled in. And we make space to have really open, vulnerable conversations about that. Because my goal is to make sure that our clients never feel like they're going in alone with their show. That's why we have these high quality editing services and the thoughtful, strategic, and emotional support that you need to help you and your show succeed. So that's my pitch. It's time for me to wrap this episode up. I got long-winded again. My apologies, friends. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, there are free resources in the show notes. There's a link if you want to submit a question for a future episode. I am so grateful you're here. I hope to see some of you. I hope some of you listen in and become Softer Sounds clients in the future. I'd love to have you in the fold. And until next time, my friends, I will see you on the softer side of podcasting. Bye.